Welcome back. Now we need to take a look at what life was like in ancient Egypt. Please remember to look over the lecture terms and memorize them and the associated material so that you can do well on the exams. Much like with the Sumerians, whose civilization developed alongside the banks of the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers, when we talk about Egyptian civilization, it too will be actually entirely dependent upon the freshwater course known as the Nile River. This civilization literally could not have existed without this particular source of fresh water for drinking, for fishing, for transportation, and perhaps most importantly for fertilizing their cropland. This is a modern-day satellite image of North Africa. You can see that the Sahara Desert, this is the eastern part of the Sahara Desert, but that it dominates this entire landmass. And that aside from this tiny little strip of green snaking alongside the banks of the Nile River, that this agriculturally is a wasteland. And so the Nile River is crucially important to the development of Egyptian civilization. And the people who lived along its banks were very much aware of this. The Egyptians, much like the Sumerians, will be a polytheistic peoples, meaning that they will worship many different deities. And one of their deities, as you've probably already guessed, will be the Nile River itself. In the Hymn to the Nile, a song that was created to honor the god associated with the river, it is described as, quote, "the bringer of food, rich in provisions, creator of all good, Lord of majesty." The Egyptian method of farming was so successful, in fact, that between about 3000 and 1250 BC, the Egyptians, their civilization in the middle of a desert, will grow so much food that they will have enough of a surplus that they will be able to export and feed other societies in the region. Another important point about Egyptian civilization is the fact that they're going to create a fairly long-lived empire. From an early starting point of around 3100 BC, the Egyptians living in a number of settlements hugging the Nile River will all start to owe common allegiance to a ruling family. Now, it'll be a series of ruling families, of course, during stretching across an enormous expanse of time. You can see the timeline here. It'll be a lot of different ruling families from one point to another, but the fact that you're going to have some of these dynasties, as they're known, ruling families, lasting for 200, 300, 400 years at a stretch, it's going to be the fact that you're going to have relative peace and quiet for long periods of time, hundreds and hundreds of years, that will allow Egyptian civilization really to flower. The fact that they have a relatively stable political system, in other words, will lead to an overabundance of discoveries, and from medicine to engineering to astronomy. Egypt will have an exceptionally long and rich history, due in large measure to the fact that you're going to have these long ruling dynasties, some brief periods of civil war, and then the establishment of another ruling dynasty. A good example of Egyptian innovation will be developing their own system of writing, which we often refer to as hieroglyphics. The term means sacred carvings, and it was in fact carved in tomb walls and tablets. But the Egyptians will go a little bit beyond that technology for encoding their information. Instead, they're also going to develop an early form of paper from a reed that grows on the banks of the Nile River, known as papyrus. Gathering up the stems, crushing them together, expelling the water, flattening them out, they will create papyrus scrolls. And then they will mix pigments and animal blood and things from the soil to create different colors. And then they will, start to encode their information on these papyrus rolls by using these early forms of ink. Beyond the development of hieroglyphics, Egyptians also excelled in medicine. You have ancient physicians already learning how to set broken bones and suture wounds together. You have Egyptian mathematicians that are going far beyond just addition and subtraction and multiplication. They're enlarging the field of geometry. Some of the earliest surviving works of mathematics, in fact, come from the Egyptian civilization. The art of glassmaking. They are excelling on a number of different fronts in the ancient world. The Egyptians, of course, were also master stonemasons, engineers, and builders. Of course, among the most enduring and iconic structures that the Egyptians left behind were their pyramid complexes. So we need to take some time to understand the massive expense of labor and time involved in building these gargantuan complexes. Put very simply, the reason why the Egyptians likely expended the labor of hundreds of thousands of individuals over decades, not to mention centuries, in these multiple complexes, was to honor their deceased leaders, which became known as pharaohs. The term pharaoh means great house. And Egyptian pharaohs were somewhat singular in human history in the degree of authority that they held. Because Egyptian pharaohs were, of course, the head of the ruling dynasties, but they were not only the ultimate political authority. They had all the authority associated with any king, when to go to war, what the tax rate should be, those sorts of decisions. But also, Egyptian pharaohs were considered to be the ultimate religious authority. So a lot of this stemmed from popular belief that the pharaoh was actually a god incarnate, meaning a god or a deity walking amongst humans. And so, because this was the commonly accepted belief, when pharaohs passed away, there were no expenses spared in trying to honor them in their transition to the afterlife. So the tombs of these pharaohs housed within these pyramids were lavishly decorated. You can see some paintings from the inside of one of these tombs. Their bodies were mummified or preserved so that they might be of some use in the afterlife. Elaborate carved wood coffins overlaid with gold leaf. Within their tombs, they would be buried with containers of wine and food. In this case, they would also be buried with some of their favorite servants. This is an instance where you do not want to be employee of the month. The favored servants would follow their pharaoh into the afterlife. And speaking of an afterlife, the Egyptians did believe that there was an existence after our mortal existence. They characterized an essential spirit. We would say today maybe it's the equivalent of a soul, something that outlives the death of the human body. This Egyptian essential spirit was known as Ka, K-A, and was often represented in Egyptian hieroglyphics by the symbol here you can see of upstretched arms. What's also interesting about Egyptian religious belief and their society, because it lasts for so long, is you can see an interesting evolution of their religious belief. They were polytheistic, as I mentioned earlier. They ended up having many different gods and goddesses to the tune of about 3,000 different deities over time. And some of these gods and goddesses, there will start to be legends surrounding them, sort of an oral history about the lives that they reportedly lived. Some of them will take up on aspects of animal form. You can see Ammit here, which is sort of a mashup of 3 different animals. Those who lived along the Nile River often worshipped Ammit because she represented 3 animals that might prey upon them and their livestock: the head of a crocodile, the body of a lion, and the rear of a hippopotamus, 3 very deadly animals. So that's an interesting example of animals being represented as deities in Egyptian art. You also see that slowly human form starts to appear as representations of Egyptian deities over time. Egyptians were definitely preoccupied with what happened to you after you died. While they did not believe in a heaven per se or a hell in sort of modern Western belief, they did believe that your ultimate goal was to get to the fabled field of reeds, where you would hope to be able to reunite with former family members and friends, see them in the afterlife. The problem, according to Egyptian cosmology, is you had some hurdles to overcome before you got to this field of reeds. So they developed a handbook or a guidebook to help navigate the dangers of the afterlife, the Book of the Dead, which was probably compiled over many different centuries, but we see the first recordings of it around about 1500 BC. It contained a number of incantations and spells to protect yourself from evil spirits, and it also included some recommendations on what to say to Osiris, who was the gatekeeper, or the bouncer, if you will, for this epic after party in the field of reeds. You had to get past Osiris. He had to evaluate your good and bad deeds. So the Book of the Dead offered you some study tips on what to say to Osiris to help get you into your final destination. I want to say a little bit of a word about relations, gender relations in the ancient world. Almost all ancient societies, Egyptian society included, were patriarchal. They were male-dominated societies in which women had no real educational opportunities. Women were expected to labor in the home, but not really outside of the home. Theirs was a very much restricted existence. Legally speaking, too, they had virtually no rights. They certainly didn't participate in the political system at that time. So this was very common across a number of ancient cultures. Now, in Egyptian society, we do see that women held a slightly higher status. Legally speaking, for example, women could initiate divorce in ancient Egypt, something they could not do in other societies like Samaria. They could not, they could open business ventures for themselves, something that was punishable by death in Sumerian society was actually allowed among the Egyptians. And in very, very rare cases, you might see an instance where a woman might ascend to the highest ranks of power, but this is exceedingly rare and was considered very abnormal for its time. For a woman to become political leader, and especially pharaoh like Hatshepsut did in 1473, was, I can't emphasize this enough, very rare, almost unheard of in Egyptian history. But it did happen. Hatshepsut was a fascinating figure who basically, when her husband died, her stepson was not old enough to take over power himself. She will step in and rule in his stead. That is, until he reaches the age where he wants to take over power all to himself. And she says, I don't think so. I've got it. She sort of pushes him to the side and takes control of things. Hatshepsut will rule for 21 years amid a period of relative peace. She will establish trade with a number of other cultures and keep her army busy on these trade expeditions so that no one could rebel against her. Now, all human societies over time have self-segregated into various socioeconomic classes, and the Egyptians were no different than all other societies. So a definite hierarchy of certain groups. I've already mentioned the concept of a nobility. You can guess in Egyptian society, the pharaoh's family, and government officials would have formed that uppermost class of highly influential and powerful religious and economic figures. Beneath them, though, you're going to have your merchants, your craftsmen, your regular freedmen and women, and then finally at the bottom, slaves who had no rights and were often captives of war. They were the losers in battle. That's how they ended up in their position. And slavery was quite common as well in the ancient world across cultures. In fact, this too does not speak very well for humanity's sake, but no matter where you look on the globe, at one time or another, every human society has enslaved fellow human beings. And in the ancient world, as I said, primarily those who were enslaved were simply the losers in battle. They forfeited their freedom. And in some cases it was debtors, those that got far enough behind in debt that they had to simply sell their labor for a period of time to pay off their debts.